our keynote speaker will be here very soon, and so we want to get started with opening remarks, and I'm going to turn over to Morgan here.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's Corporate Roundtable on Global Climate Reporting. My name is Morgan Witt, Community Manager with SEC Pro, and we've partnered with XBRL US to bring everyone together today for a conversation on evolving climate reporting and how companies are preparing for it. Now, SEC Pro is part of Pro Groups, which is a community of accounting and finance, sustainability, and audit and risk professionals. Members have access to things like free webinars and events, updates and trends from experts, opportunities to share and connect with peers, and we also have an online community and over 25 active chapters across the US, including two in San Francisco and Silicon Valley that will be relaunching with a meeting next week. The other thing is that we have no membership dues or fees, so we are a free and open community and love to connect with professionals. We do have a table over here at the back, so if you're interested in learning more or connecting with us, please stop by and talk to me or Lauren. You can also visit progroups.org to learn more about SEC Pro and Pro Groups. I also wanted to let you know quickly that SEC Pro is sponsoring today's CPE that you will be earning by attending these sessions. So please make sure that you have signed in and included your check-in time at the check-in table over there by the door. And if you are leaving early, just make sure to put your time out before you leave. And with that, I will pass it over to Michelle Savage with XBRL US.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm with an organization called XBRL US, which I think many of you are familiar with. We are a nonprofit data standards organization. And our mission is to support and to promote the use of open data standards. Open data standards can transform data into machine-readable, fully automatable information that is a lot easier and less expensive to analyze and to understand. We're very happy to support the climate initiatives here in California, Senate Bill 253 and 261. We see these as a way to help businesses, regulators, and the citizens of California, like myself, better understand how greenhouse gas emissions and other climate actions are affecting our environment. We also very strongly believe that digitizing climate data, from emissions data to textual information like company targets and strategies, will have two very important benefits. First, it will ensure that the data that's reported is more timely, that it's interoperable with other reported data like company emissions reporting in other states and in other countries. And secondly, we believe that digitizing climate data will reduce the reporting burden on companies because many non-US regulatory programs, as you'll hear about today, are requiring that data be produced in a digital XBRL format. So companies can align with these reporting requirements if California regulations require the same reports in the same structured data format. So today's program will focus on the ever-changing climate requirements, and then we're going to have a panel of accounting professionals who will share their insights into how companies are preparing for these requirements. That will be followed by an open discussion among all of our attendees here into how other companies are preparing and what we're seeing in the marketplace. Discussion questions have been distributed in advance, and you'll also find them in the back of your little handout that you received at the start of the session. Let's see back right here. Okay, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. If everybody could take a seat. Okay, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Scott Wiener. Senator Wiener sponsored Senate Bill 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. He represents San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. Elected in 2016, Senator Wiener focuses on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. He chairs the Senate Housing Committee and is co-chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus. He's a past chair of the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus. Before his election to the Senate, Senator Wiener served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing the district previously represented by Harvey Milk. He also chaired the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, and before taking office, Senator Wiener practiced law for 15 years, including nearly a decade as a deputy city attorney in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. He also served in a number of community leadership roles, including co-chair of the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Senator Wiener has lived in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 1997. He has degrees from Duke University and Harvard Law School and was a Fulbright Scholar in Santiago, Chile. With that, I'm going to turn over to Senator Wiener. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon. Yes, afternoon. Thanks for being here and for the work that you're doing to try to move us towards a more sustainable future. Your work now becomes even more important as we embark on this new, it feels like it's been years, but it's only been a few months, of an administration that seems bound and determined to take a wrecking ball, not just to climate action, but to all science. And we see what's happening with really all of the federal science agencies that are being just eviscerated before our eyes. And so we have an administration that appears to want to take us back to the Middle Ages before we started being able to cure diseases and make people's lives better through science. And so it's really scary, but it sort of underlines California's significance. We are a leader, long been a leader on climate. We've long been a leader on healthcare and biotech and tech innovation generally, and just scientific inquiry, whether at the UC or Stanford or in Silicon Valley or any of the other epicenters of science in this state. That role is now even more important, and we need to continue to step it up. And we've seen from the wildfires in LA in January, just beyond devastating. Yesterday, I no longer chair the Housing Committee, I chair the Budget Committee, and I just met with leadership from LA County yesterday, and what LA is going to have to go through to rebuild is just, it's hard to really get your head around it. And we know that that's because of climate change. It's making all of these disasters much, much worse than they would have been decades ago. And we know that we can address it. We just have to have the will to do it. And here in California, we do. And we have to lead, not just nationally, but globally. And Senate Bill 253 is part of that because transparency is an essential building block towards grappling with any issue, and that includes carbon emissions. And as we've gone through, it took us 3 years to get SB 253 passed and signed into law, and it's now been about a year and a half since the governor signed it. The world is watching. Yes, other states were watching us, but the world is watching, and we get inquiries, from Europe and elsewhere on a regular basis. And so what we do here really, really matters. And the bill is now being implemented. It's been a little bit slower than I would have ideally liked, but that's a whole other issue about how we get government to move more quickly, a much broader conversation. But I do want to encourage you to engage with the California Air Resources Board, CARB, as it goes through its process of collecting information from stakeholders so that the final regulations that it enacts, which we think will happen by the end of this year, make the law as easy to implement as possible. And I've encouraged CARB to really try to keep it as simple and basic as possible. This does not need to be overly complex. And I think by industry stakeholders providing good feedback, I think we can help keep it, avoid making it overly complex, because the whole, in constructing SB 253, we really worked hard to try to make it streamlined and simple, to provide that you can, if you're disclosing in another jurisdiction, you can rely on that, whether it's for your entire disclosure or for part of your disclosure. We don't want people to have to recreate the wheel, and there were a number of other aspects of SB 253 that we were very intentional in terms of just trying to make it straightforward for people. I have no desire to make any business have to spend more effort than is needed to accomplish the goal that we all want, which is simply to have transparency in carbon emissions. So I'm really excited that this is moving forward, also in companionship with Senate Bill 261 in terms of climate risks. And when you look at what's happening here, what could be happening in other states, and also what's happening in Europe and parts of Asia, I think we are moving towards a much broader regime in terms of broader and broader transparency. We know that there are so many corporations that take carbon reduction and sustainability very, very seriously, and we're so grateful to those corporations that have really stepped up. And quite a few of those corporations supported SB 253 and broke away from the oil industry and the banking industry that were opposing it so aggressively, and that really made all the difference, frankly, because when you had some in industry saying this is impossible to implement, and we could say no, there are like however many dozens of companies, including some of the largest companies on the planet, who are supporting the bill, it really signaled to my colleagues that it didn't have a lot of credibility to say that it was going to be hard or impossible to implement. So we're really grateful, look forward to your continued engagement. As I said, we want CARB to get this right, and I think CARB is, from my perspective, committed to getting it right, and I look forward to the full implementation, and California continuing to lead during these difficult times. So thank you very much.
We have a few questions, if that's okay. The first question that came in through Slido, and recall, you can put your questions in here, is once companies implement climate reporting, do you think it would be helpful for cities, counties, transit agencies, and other local governments to follow suit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an important trend, and my hope is that in the years to come we'll see very, very broad, transparent carbon reporting, so that in all aspects of life people can know, first of all, who's walking the walk and who's talking the talk, but from their own choices, we'll be able to know what's more or less carbon intensive, and so I hope so, and I hope, and I think it'll increasingly over time just become, obviously the data from the very beginning for researchers, for folks who are really into the data are going to be able to make really good use of it. But over time, we want it to be really understandable for just everyday people in their lives as they make decisions.
Okay. That actually is a good segue to the next question: is how do you anticipate the data being used?
Yeah, I think we'll see researchers using it. We'll see investors using it. I think we will see corporations using it to say, my can of soda uses half the carbon as my competitor's can of soda. Mm-hmm. To use that example, and so I think you're gonna see it used in a lot of ways. I am sure there will be websites that will pop up to try to make it easier for consumers to take a look and compare and contrast, and that's how I see it, at least in the early days being used.
Okay, we've gotten some other questions in here, so we're getting a lot of questions now. What are the penalties to entities outside of California who do not abide by requirements?
Well, if the law is triggered by doing business in California, so even though they might be headquartered outside of California, they're doing business in California, and so I don't remember the penalty. There are penalties for not complying. Do you remember the monetary? Yeah, up to $500,000, and so that they'll be penalized the same as this. It's very important. There's always, some of the opposition were very inaccurately telling people, oh, this is going to disadvantage California companies. They're not going to want to headquarter here. I'm like, headquartering here is irrelevant. We're treating California companies and out of state exactly the same. If you do business here, you have to follow the law.
Great. The next question is, how would you ideally achieve consistent standards across different states and jurisdictions for sustainability-related reporting and metrics?
Yeah, so in ideal world, we would have a Congress that was interested and able in engaging in aggressive climate action, which it did with the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course the new administration is trying to tear apart. But we ideally, it would be great if we could just enact this at the federal level and have one law for the whole country. That I'm not holding my breath. We know that they think that this is just they're woke or whatever they're calling it these days, or DEI. I guess I just saw that now they consider sexual assault, breast cancer, and Holocaust Remembrance Day as part of DEI. So it's a growing category of things. So they're not going to be doing this. So California is perfectly positioned because we are fifth largest economy in the world, and we can have a real impact. I'm not sure what's going to happen in other states. I mean, we really want to make sure we're not creating any difficulties because of multiple rules. So I would hope that if other states do it, they make it do what we did, which is to say, if you're already disclosing, you don't have to redo it. You can basically just, to use a old school thing, staple the report to this report or whatever. Just be an attachment. It'll be a PDF you can just attach, upload. But other states may want to consider whether they want to do it, because if depending on how many companies they're going to cover, it may be that those companies are all covered by the California rule. I know that when there were some questions about the pace of CARB's implementation of the law, and there was a lot of speculation about, is California really going to implement it? And I was very clear from the beginning, of course we're going to implement it, and yes, and we are. And it's, like I said, it's taking a little longer than we wanted, but only by a matter of months. And so it is going to be implemented. Companies will be doing Scope 1 and 2 disclosures in 2026, Scope 3 disclosures starting in 2027. So the timetable for disclosures in California is the same as what the governor signed in 2023, 2026, 2027, and then the higher level of Scope 3 a few years later. And so I think states should consider whether they really need to pass all. There might be states that are covering a bunch of entities that are not doing business in California. I just don't know.
Okay, and that actually covers another question that was asked about states, but is California doing anything to kind of reach out to some of the other states to ensure that there isn't a patchwork of regulations?
I know that our sponsors have been, our coalition, Yeah, so Ceres in particular, one of the co-sponsors of the bill, they talk to anywhere the bills are pending or being considered, they're talking to people. So there is that level of coordination. I've spoken to various legislators from other states who either were considering a bill or had introduced a bill.
Okay. All right, let's see. This is kind of a different question. How is CARB encouraged to streamline reporting requirements when they're grappling with changing international regulations?
Wait, say that again?
How is CARB encouraged to streamline reporting requirements and kind of be in sync with other requirements when there's a changing international regulations like CSRD of late?
Yeah, and by the way, my understanding, I think there was some criticism of what the EU was doing, but I think the EU is just trying to make it easier, because when you look at, like, for example, the UK's carbon reporting system was much more streamlined and simple than the EU, and I think the EU, is trying to simplify it, which I think is, honestly a reasonable thing to do. And so, CARB the way the law is designed is that, for example, if another country enacts a disclosure that's broader than ours, then that should satisfy California, and the regulation, I mean, that's in the law, so the regulation should reflect that.
So you can use the same report, essentially.
But I think it's important for folks to be involved in the CARB process, and our coalition is very involved. We're working with CARB. I've met with them directly. We want them to really just make it nimble and straightforward.
Okay, great. I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, no
I'm going to
problem.
take just a couple more questions here. Is there any concern that the current administration will push back having companies apply with 253 and 261?
Well, the current administration, he thinks he's the king, and he issues these edicts, and it's scary, but he's not the king, and he has no power to do anything about SB 253. Congress could seek to preempt it, like it can with a lot of laws, but you typically don't preempt unless you're passing your own. So I guess I don't. We'll see, and obviously that would be a fight, and there might be other items they want to preempt more than a simple disclosure. So far nothing has happened on that front, and if it does, our Attorney General, we allocated him $25 million at the beginning of the year to make sure he has the capacity to sue the Trump administration as many times as he needs to defend California. And if this happens, it would be one more lawsuit.
Okay.
We're determined to defend this law if they attack it.
Okay, some of these questions kind of interact with other ones we already had. Do you believe that regulatory reporting requirements, as opposed to voluntary reporting around climate data, will be an incentive for companies to focus their efforts on climate impact more?
Yeah, we've had voluntary reporting for a long time. You have companies that collect the data, or they collect some of the data but not other data, or they disclose data, some but not other, or it's unclear what they're disclosing or if they're being complete. And the value of having a law is that everyone is in a level playing field, that everyone is collecting and disclosing the same data. And you don't have to wonder, okay, this company disclosed, but what did they really disclose? And so it's much, much more useful to just have a standardized rule for everyone.
Okay, and I'll just give you one
Yeah.
last question here. Where do you see companies who have never reported on climate inputting this information? Would it be a standalone report or some kind of other public disclosures like a proxy or a 10K?
No, there will be we actually, in the follow-up legislation we did last year, we authorized CARB, if they want to, they can do it in-house, or they can retain someone to sort of set up the reporting or the website and how it's disclosed. So there's a report that'll have to be submitted, and then either CARB or an outside contractor will be responsible for compiling it and having it, hosting it on a website that people can use. So there will have to be a formal submission to CARB. They can also put it on whatever other report they want to put it on, but they'll have to do that formal report to CARB.
Okay, great. Okay, I think those are all the
Great.
questions. I don't want to take any more of your
Thank
time. I really
you.
appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you're welcome to stay and have lunch, or take a lunch to go. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, our next panel is, actually, sorry. Okay, So we're going to move on to our first panel session. And it's going to focus on climate mandates that we're seeing in Europe and other countries, and also on those here at home, like the California mandates. There's a lot of overlap, obviously, between these programs, and it's important for regulators to be mindful against duplicate reporting and to coordinate with other regulators, as we talked about, to minimize reporting burden. So I'm going to ask Amy and Dan to come up, and I will introduce them. Yeah, I'll sit there. You can just have a seat here, and I'll just introduce you really quick here. Okay, so our speakers on this panel are Amy Beers. Amy is a CPA. She is a CGMA, which is a Chartered Global Management Accountant, Senior Director, Assurance and Advisory Innovation at the AICPA. And we also have Dan Kreckelberg, who is Climate Strategy Director at Eco Engineers. Dan is a California-based sustainability consultant working with both public and private sector clients. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Amy to start.
Oh, I think you're starting.
I'll start first.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dan to start.
Hello, everyone. I want to start off by thanking XBRL US for hosting this event and SEC Pro for sponsoring as well. It's great to be here and to provide some background information on some of the regulations and frameworks that are driving corporate sustainability reporting globally. I'm going to start off with some information about the CSRD program in Europe. So those are the European regulations that are driving reporting for companies there. But not just in Europe. There are supply chain considerations within that program that make that globally applicable. I'm then going to turn to the ISSB, the IFRS standards that have come out of the ISS, the International Sustainability Standards Board's work. And those apply to jurisdictions outside of, there's many jurisdictions that applies to, including here domestically. I'll get into that detail more in my slides. And then I'll focus it on state mandates and specifically look at the work in California that's being done and coming up soon to require companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk. So starting off with the CSRD, so this was adopted in 2023. Went into effect January 1st, 2024. And this is one of several European Union directives aimed at corporate sustainability. Some of the other ones you may have heard of are the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD. But this CSRD is really focused on the reporting aspects of corporate sustainability. It looks at greenhouse gas emissions, other environmental metrics, social and governance related as well. This work has moved forward through the development of a set of standards called the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And those are developed by a technical advisory group called the EFRAG that is reporting to the European EU Commission on implementation of this program. The ESRS covers 12 topic areas. There are sector-specific disclosure categorizations. The ESRS standard specific to greenhouse gas reporting is the ESRS E1, covering scopes 1, 2, and 3. And there are digital reporting requirements as part of this mandate. So that would require companies to align with the EU's taxonomy and include XBRL tagging in some of that. And Michelle will get into more of the tagging discussion later on. And this is set up, this program, for a phased implementation, starting with the largest EU-listed companies, and then expanding out to another group of listed companies in 2026, transitioning to small and medium-sized enterprises in 2027, and then including non-EU companies with EU operations later in this decade, 2029. There are also assurance requirements, which Amy will describe in a later portion of the presentation. Okay. A big announcement last month. There was a published a proposal called the Omnibus Amendment, which proposed some major changes to the CSRD. Now, this was known for some time, that a proposal would go forward, making some changes to the reporting requirements and the scope of companies that are required to comply. And Senator Wiener mentioned that was those changes were underway, and so this is what that was referring to. Now, I'll point out that this is a proposal. This still needs to go through a legislative process in Europe to actually move forward on these changes. But what we can tell so far from the proposal is that it would represent a pretty significant rollback in the number of companies that would be required to report by basically, changing the thresholds of which companies are required to report. So it would reduce those covered entities to those with over 1,000 employees and turnover over 50 million or assets over 25 million. So this, by some estimates, would be an 80% reduction in the number of companies that fall within the scope of the reporting. It's proposed to remove sector-specific standards for disclosure. It would require that the ESRSs be simplified, and there was already discussion of simplification of these standards for small and medium-sized businesses, but those simplifications could apply to a broader range of companies, including larger ones. And then delay the timing of the implementation by 2 years for the second wave of companies that would be required to report. So all in all, some pretty significant changes. One thing that is not proposed for change is the digital reporting requirements for XBRL, but the timing for those going into effect would be determined in future rulemakings. So that's a kind of high-level overview of some of those changes. Those changes are important because they're kind of setting the tone. The European Union was, pretty far out ahead on some of these regulations. But that said, there are mandates in other places that are also driving corporate sustainability reporting. So a lot of, jurisdictions continue to look to what's happening in Europe, but also consider how their mandates are going forward and the rules that are associated with it. So next steps for this. Next 2 to 3 months, the omnibus may be finalized through that legislative process. And the European Securities Markets Authority may issue a new consultation to look at how the rules are applied within the rules that they enforce. Okay. Moving on. I want to talk about the IFRS reporting countries. So the IFRS a few years ago developed the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. This group worked to develop standards that integrated non-financial reporting related to sustainability into the existing IFRS standards. So actually creating some new standards. And also integrating some existing frameworks into those standards. So specifically the SASB standards that many of you would be familiar with, and also the Task Force on Climate-Related Financials Disclosures guidance was also incorporated into the IFRS standards. And we actually have someone here today from the IFRS Foundation. Victoria Reyes is here. So if we get into questions about this one, we can direct those to Victoria. So the thing to mention about these standards is that they are designed for voluntary reporting, but also can be adopted by jurisdictions to create mandatory disclosure programs. And that's happened to some degree in 36 countries. And I've got them listed here on this slide. And it's really global adoption of this. It's looking at greenhouse gas emissions, but also broader climate risks and opportunities related to sustainability. And so these jurisdictions here have adopted in some form requirements that are aligned with the ISSB framework. So this is great because it gives these countries some comparability between the data, provides direction to companies on how to do those disclosures. And I should mention also aligns with other standards that are in existence. So for example, on the greenhouse gas emissions portion, there's a reference to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to use that as the standard for doing scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. Now, many of these jurisdictions will also be requiring the XBRL be used for that reporting. And there is a taxonomy that has been developed alongside these standards that guides this XBRL tagging and reporting, the digitization of the data that is disclosed. So timing, it really varies on each jurisdiction and when they've adopted this and when those go into effect. But we're starting to see companies preparing using these standards, and those disclosures go into effect. So by 2026, we'll see a pretty strong wave of the first disclosures that are coming out of the ISSB aligned jurisdictions. Okay, and this is just covering the digital reporting requirements. So as I mentioned, inline XBRL preparation, it's in the CSRD beginning in year 2 of each phase. And then for the IFRS, ISSB standards, those are dependent on the regulations that have been developed for those standards in each country. Okay, I'm going to mention briefly the SEC climate disclosure rule. So this final rule was adopted in March 6, 2024. Shortly thereafter, a stay was issued following a wave of lawsuits for the program. There were several lawsuits on the program in the federal courts. So this SEC rule, it would have required greenhouse gas emissions disclosure for scope 1 and 2 emissions. It would have recovered material climate risks and strategies to be disclosed by companies that file, listed companies that file reports with the SEC as part of the non-financial disclosure, the 10K section of their disclosure reports. Also a phase-in proposed for this program. So it would start with the largest companies and type of disclosure. So this was to be implemented over several years. Now, following the stay and the lawsuits and the change in administration, there is a new acting chair of the SEC that has announced that they will not defend this rule within the courts, which basically extends the hold. So not seeing this going forward anytime soon, but it is a reference point for some of the mandates that have been put forward at a national level. All right. California, okay. So I'm going to talk about the SB 253 and 261. as amended by SB 19. It was another piece of legislation. So 253 covers public and privately held companies with $1 billion in revenue doing business in California, requiring them to disclose scope 1 and 2 and 3 greenhouse gas emissions in conformance with the greenhouse gas protocol. Now, this was also set up that if there were other national or international reporting requirements in place, that reporters could also include information from that disclosure as well. The dates for reporting, 2026 and scope 3 in 2027 is what was included in the bills. And also having insurance requirements for this, which Amy will talk about. And a call for this to be digitally reported. So although XBRL is not mentioned in the legislation, it does call for the creation of a publicly accessible digital platform with emissions data accessible for use in an electronic format. So that is a recognition that this data should be made accessible and available to the public once it's reported to the California Air Resources Board. Now, rulemaking has commenced on this, and there has been a request for information by the California Air Resources Board. The deadline for that is actually tomorrow. So, companies, organizations are putting in comment letters about this law, and there's quite a number of questions in there about how CARB wants to approach this, or just thinking through the various aspects of it. But per Senate Bill 219, which passed last year, there is a deadline to develop rules for this program by January 1st, 2025. So program is coming soon. And alongside of that, SB 261, that's the Climate-Related Financial Risk Act. This covers the climate risk aspects of corporate sustainability reporting. The covered entities are companies with 500 million or more in revenue that are doing business in California. So again, doing business in California means that the scope of the program would extend beyond California. And actually, one of the questions in the CARB request for information is how that should be defined. So they are looking at some regulations that exist for tax reporting. So companies that maybe are incorporated outside of California but do business here, pay taxes to the state, and they're looking at potentially leveraging that to define doing business in the state. So the reporting requirements here are looking at alignment with, well, they point to two different types of frameworks that could be used for making this disclosure. But the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and Successor Framework, which is the ISSB's standards. That work of the TCFD has been merged into the ISSB's work. And so companies that publish reports using that framework would be in compliance with this. And it calls for companies to report this every 2 years, starting January 1st, 2026. And they're to post that information on their website. So this is not like a central spot with CARB or any other agency where this is reported, but it's published to the company's website. SB 219 amended 253 and 261. It gave CARB an extra 6 months to design rules, so that January 1st, 2025 date was the result of an extension on rule development. It allows CARB to choose to contract with a third-party reporting organization to receive the emissions reports under 253 or develop the program in-house. And it allows companies to consolidate their GHG emissions reporting at the parent company level. So that was added to reflect the fact that companies have subsidiaries, and the parent company level would allow that reporting to be done for the primary organization. Okay, timeline for this. Yeah, so a lot's happening in 2025. The comment period ends tomorrow. There will be workshop and consultations. CARB has a process for rulemaking, which they typically follow for all of their programs. And what we expect to see is that by the mid part of 2025, there will be some rules in place to provide some certainty on what the program looks like and the compliance requirements. Okay, and on that note about California, there are several other states that are considering similar legislation. Right now, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois have proposed or introduced legislation that tracks fairly closely with 253, 261 in California. There are some differences in terms of compliance dates, when the reports need to be issued for different scopes, and the assurance dates as well. But generally, there is a pretty high degree of similarity, I would say, between a lot of what's proposed in other states in terms of protocols used and scopes of emissions that are required to be reported. There was also legislation proposed in Colorado that I understand has been postponed as following a committee hearing a few weeks ago. But yeah, so we're starting to see other states look into adopting similar programs. And it sounds like there's some coordination that's happening between states to just make sure that these programs are working together and that companies complying in one state will be providing the right information that could be used for compliance in another one as well. And on that note, that's my presentation, and I'm going to hand it over to Amy Beers to talk more about assurance requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, XBRL, for having me today. You'll excuse me, I do have a tissue. I think I caught either a cold coming over on the plane last night or allergies. You can never tell this time of year, so if I use it, just excuse me. So, talking a little bit about the assurance requirements for all of these laws. Obviously, I've grayed out the boxes for the SEC climate rule that did have or does have assurance requirements with limited and reasonable assurance, starting 3 years after the first submissions, and then moving to reasonable 7 years after. But as Dan explained, we probably don't expect to see much movement with the SEC rule anytime soon, at least probably in the next 4 years. So, but moving over to EU and California, there are assurance requirements for both of those laws. They both start with limited assurance, and they kick in immediately, so there's really no grace period. And so in the EU, the assurance is limited assurance on your first reports. It covers the entire report, so not just GHG emissions, all of the information. The assurance also covers the assessment of materiality. So the auditor will actually have to look at the process that the company undertook to determine what they're reporting. It had, the original law had a stipulation that they would assess in the future to determine the feasibility of reasonable assurance. Now, the omnibus removed any mention of reasonable assurance from the omnibus, so from the proposal. So we'll have to see where that goes. As Dan mentioned, it's not set in stone. It has to be approved and voted on. For California, also starting with limited assurance, and so the initial reports will require limited assurance on scopes 1 and 2, and then moving to scope 3 by 2030. They'll also be assessing reasonable assurance
and starting in '23, I'm sorry, it actually will go into effect, reasonable assurance on scopes 1 and 2, and they'll assess scope 3 going forward. So looking at the standards for both reporting and assurance, and Dan mentioned that all the states that are looking at this, and so did Senator Wiener. And, you know, it's really important that you have standardized standards for both reporting and assurance. And so with all of this activity that we're seeing in the different states, we decided to put this white paper together. And so this white paper, we partnered with the Center for Audit Quality, which is an affiliate of the AICPA. And it is a paper that talks about when lawmakers and regulators are considering putting in rules and laws about sustainability information and disclosures, what should they be considering? And so basically, in terms of using recognized reporting standards, obviously recognized reporting standards provide the consistency and comparability across entities, allows for simplifying compliance because companies who are already disclosing this information in other jurisdictions can utilize those same standards here in the United States as they report to the different states. We also talk about using standardized assurance standards, so standards that go through a due diligence process that have recognized terms, recognized definitions, and established procedures. So if an assurance provider is using these established standards, users of the report will understand the procedures that the auditor undertook. They'll understand the report. They're used to seeing that report. So very important to use recognized assurance standards. And finally, the CPA profession, in terms of their qualifications for providing assurance, they go through obviously a very rigorous process to get licensed. They need to maintain their independence. We've got standards and codes that they need to follow for following independence and ethics requirements. There's also a quality control standard where auditors will actually have to submit their work to a peer review program where their insurance engagements are then reviewed by an independent body to make sure that those engagements are conducted in accordance with the standards. So our recommendation is that if they're establishing assurance to be performed on this information, that they should have minimum requirements for the assurance provider. And so the AICPA has partnered with the California State Society here in California on our response to CARB. And we'll be submitting that today. And it bases most of these positions on this paper. So if you're interested, you can go to our website, you can download the paper, but those are pretty much the highlights. So many people ask, well, what's the difference between limited assurance and reasonable assurance, and what does that mean? And so I can answer that from a CPA perspective based on our standards, because our standards are free and open to the public, and U.S. CPAs need to follow the AICPA attestation standards on any information that they are providing assurance on that fall outside of the financial statements themselves. So they use this attestation set of standards to perform this work. And so the assurance engagement requires that the auditor obtain evidence that the subject matter is in accordance with the criteria. So the criteria would be the standards that the company is reporting against. So you've got ISSB, you've got the EU, ERSs, or the GHG protocol could be considered criteria. So the auditor is looking at the criteria to determine that the company is reporting in accordance with that. Now, we've got different levels of assurance, limited assurance and reasonable assurance. And reasonable assurance is the highest level of assurance, and you can think of it as the audit of the financial statements, where the auditor is going to go in, they're going to want to get an understanding of your processes and controls, understand the design of those controls, determine whether those controls have been implemented. They'll probably be doing testing of the information. Limited assurance will be less than that, and so they won't be doing as extensive testing. There might be some understanding of the process, usually through inquiry and analysis, but it's a much less engagement than reasonable. And so looking at the standards, there are international standard setters that set assurance and ethics standards. Similar to what the AICPA does in the United States, these bodies set the international standards. And so, similar to what the ISSB has done from a reporting perspective, setting a global baseline for reporting standards, these standards bodies are looking to set a global baseline for assurance standards. And so the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board sets standards for performing the engagements, and the International Ethics Standards Board has an international code of conduct setting independence and ethics standards. Both of these boards have put out new standards for specifically for sustainability assurance. And so the ISSB has put out the general requirements for sustainability assurance engagements. That is ISSA 5000. First time implementation of it becomes effective in the end of 2026, so December 15th of 2026. And it is designed so that it would be profession agnostic. So CPAs can use these standards as well as non-CPAs. It has reasonable and limited assurance requirements as well. They've also put out an implementation guide just this past January, providing examples and reporting examples and implementation guidance in applying ISSA 5000. IASBA as well has put out a new section of the code specifically for sustainability, and a new section for an area that's focused on non-CPAs, so that where non-CPAs can meet the same requirements as CPAs. And these standards are meant to work together. And actually, ISSA 5000 requires that you are meeting the independence and ethics requirements that are at least as demanding as those in IASBA. And if you do not have them, you need to meet IASBA's requirements. And so, as in the AICPA here in the US, we have a strategic objective to converge with international assurance standards when they're appropriate for the US market. And so we have been analyzing ISSA 5000. We have a number of working groups under the AICPA's Audit Standards Board that is looking at ISSA 5000 to determine what we're going to do here in the US. We are planning to issue some exposure drafts by the end of this year. Now, what we've done in looking at ISSA 5000 so far is we've noticed that there are a lot of requirements within the standard that actually would be applicable to engagements that are on broader subject matter than just sustainability. And so with those requirements, we will be updating our baseline attestation standards. So ATC 105, 205, and 210. 105 is the overarching standard for all attestation engagements. 205 is the reasonable assurance, those examinations, and 210 are limited assurance reviews. And so we will put out an exposure draft for the new requirements for the attestation standards overall, and so that'll impact all types of attestation, SOC reports, all different types of engagements, as well as sustainability. There are specific requirements within ISSA 5000 that are definitely specific and more conducive to sustainability, and so we're going to be establishing a new section of our attestation standards. We haven't numbered it yet, so I have a question mark, ATC 500. Maybe it will align to 5000, but within this exposure draft, there will be the new requirements for sustainability engagements themselves. And then similarly, how we do on the audit, we will provide in the standards a reconciliation between ISSA 5000 and the attestation standards. So for those CPAs who need to report on both. And so in the US, if a CPA, they are required to use the attestation standards. So if they need to report on ISSA 5000, they also need to do a report under the attestation standards. And so they're going to need this reconciliation. I think I'm turning it over to you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Amy. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about digital reporting, but first we have a couple of questions for you, for both of you. And remember, you can post questions in the Slido tool here. So the first question, Dan, do the California laws apply to companies at the end of their first fiscal year that ends in 2026? Or is the requirement not related to a company's fiscal year?
Well, I think this is something that's going to have to be defined within the rulemaking because it sets a year, but there's already been some questions come up about how that aligns with fiscal year or calendar year reporting for companies. And this is something that I think will have to be defined. So if there's any companies out there that have a viewpoint or preferences where when they could make this work, I would strongly encourage them to express that in the comment letter that is due tomorrow, or at other points in the rulemaking process.
And that was part of the questions that, some of the questions that they raised in
Correct.
the solicitation, right?
Correct, yep.
Okay. And a question for you, Amy. Regarding peer review, will there be a different cadence for peer review engagements for sustainability-related opinions than for financial only?
I'm not aware of a change in policy related to sustainability over financial, no. It will follow under normal attestation engagements.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so you've heard a lot about the various requirements, assurance requirements as well as disclosure requirements. You've also heard about the digital or XBRL reporting requirements. And what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is kind of take a deeper dive into what exactly do we mean when we're talking about digital reporting. You know, it sounds very high tech, but let's get into specifics about what exactly are we talking about here. So when companies report sustainability data, they can do that a lot of different ways. They could include it in their annual financial report. They could create a separate report. Many of them create sustainability reports that look like this one. This is a company called Benchmark. They created one that has lots of very glossy graphics. They're very beautiful reports. They spend a huge amount of time designing these and putting them together. There are other companies like this one from Moody's, which creates a report that is maybe a fewer design bells and whistles, but it still contains a lot of very important information. And the reason I'm showing these two reports is because we're going to use these two examples through this portion of the presentation. So I think the one thing that we see in all of these reports, be they part of the annual financial or a separate report that's created, they all contain a huge amount of data. And it's really important data, and this is, we're looking here at the Moody's Investor Services report. The Moody's report includes here the greenhouse gas emissions. They have a table. You're going to find this in pretty much every report that you find on a sustainability basis that has scope 1, 2, and 3. There's various breakdowns. This is the kind of information that will need to be reported to CSRD, to an IFRS reporting regulator, and to the state of California to satisfy Senate Bill 253. So that's the common language across everything is, scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. This is looking at the Benchmark report, and Benchmark includes a lot of text information. Moody's does too, because they're putting a lot of information in there about the disclosures that they're preparing. Explanatory text, in this case, is looking at an explanation of how they developed their greenhouse gas emissions descriptions. And this is the kind of information that, again, you see it in CSRD. You're also going to see this in reports going to IFRS reporting countries eventually through using that ISSB taxonomy that Dan talked about. And this is also information that you're going to see reported to California to satisfy Senate Bill 261, which is kind of the TCFD and the climate narrative information. So this is all great information, really important data, but right now it's in PDF files for the most part, or it might be in an HTML page. And that data is great, it's very useful, but it's very hard to get the data out. To actually use that data today requires either manual data entry, cutting and pasting data, rekeying data into another application or potentially an Excel spreadsheet, or some companies have actually started scraping data from these files, but they all require review. You still have to look at the data, make sure that it's accurate, make sure that you captured the data correctly. And that requires time. It's costly. It makes the cost of the data itself very expensive, and it makes the cost of performing analysis even more expensive. So that's where digital reporting kind of comes into play. And the reason that we're showing these two applications is because, or these two particular companies, is because some of our members, some of whom are here, have engaged with these companies to allow us to prepare their sustainability report in digital XBRL format. And one of them is Benchmark. And I want to thank Donnelly Financial Solutions, or DFIN. We have a couple people here from DFIN. I want to thank them because they were able to work with their client to get them to transform their data into XBRL digital format. The other company is Moody's, and Anna Kwok here with Workiva. I want to thank you for working with Moody's to get them to transform their report into digital structured format. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like. What does it look like when a document that is a static, kind of what we call paper-based document, like a PDF file, is transformed into something that is digitally readable? So here we're looking again at the Moody's report. Okay, it's a simple table, but it's kind of nicely defined. This is, we're looking at screenshots here, but I can actually send you a link, and there are links on our website, to direct reports that are fully human readable and machine readable. And that's what this screenshot is showing you right here. So the block of data that you see in green, all of the facts in that block of data are fully machine readable. There is information that is digitally embedded in each fact that represents, that expresses what that data point represents. So if we look at, we look at the rows and columns, we can see what the value 94,400 represents, but it also has embedded information. And the embedded information appears in a pop-up box when you click on that value. So when you click on it, it brings up a pop-up box, which you can see on the right side of the screen, which shows all the parameters, all the metadata that's in that fact. So this represents Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. It has a particular definition, which you can see in the italics down below. It's for Category 1, purchased goods and services for the period 2023. It is in thousands of metric tons, and it's for a particular reporting entity. That's the central index key, which is the identifier used to represent this company, Moody's. So all of that information is embedded in that fact, so that when a computer receives it, it knows exactly what it's getting. So we can look at it, we can read it and see what it means by looking at the rows and columns, but a computer can take that data point by itself and understand exactly what it represents. That's kind of the magic of digital reporting, but it's not really magic. Let's look at the other report. So this is for Benchmark. And Benchmark included a piece of narrative, and that narrative text is also a fact. This is something that you're going to see in Senate Bill 261. All of that information that's going to be put into a report, those blocks of text are still facts. And wouldn't it be nice if you could look at Benchmark and Moody's and 500 different companies and see what is their emissions disclosure policy? That's exactly what you can do when the data is digitized. So in this report, again, if you click on that block of text, which is now highlighted in purple, it's going to bring up that pop-up box that's going to show us this represents greenhouse gas emissions disclosure explanatory. That's the name of the XBRL tag. And this is all in the ISSB taxonomy that Dan was mentioning. This is their taxonomy. So this is the same taxonomy that companies will be using reporting to IFRS reporting countries. And it's potentially the same taxonomy they could be using to report to California. So, and this provides a lot of additional information about it. So, bottom line, what digital reporting does is it renders data machine readable, but even more importantly, machine interpretable. It's not just that you're sending a document and, from one place to another, but the machine actually understands what each of those data points represent. It's timelier because the data can be extracted and used immediately. It's less expensive to process, less expensive to analyze. So that kind of democratizes access to all of this data. And also very important, it establishes a shared understanding of the reported data. So the reporting entity that prepares that data and sends it to their shareholders, to prospective investors, to regulators, they all have a complete, unambiguous understanding of what the data represents. They're speaking the same language. It also enables comparability, because if all the data can be pulled in easily, we're all speaking the same language, we can compare, one entity to another, one entity to 5,000 others, very easily and automatically. And we talked a lot about what's happening outside the United States, but inside the United States as well, digital reporting has been the norm for 20 years. Okay, in the US, there's been digital reporting. Banks have to report to the FDIC. They've been doing this for 20 years, since 2005. So it's standard practice. The SEC began requiring public companies and investment management companies to report in structured XBRL formats in 2009. So they all have a practice, they're used to it, they have tools that they use every day. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is the most recent US regulator that began requiring digital reporting. So public utilities have been reporting in XBRL format since 2021. So there's a very large pool of companies in the United States that are very familiar with structured data reporting, digital reporting. So it makes logical sense to go from financial data in digital format to climate data in digital format. So how do we get started with this? We start with something called a taxonomy. And I'm going to get a little technical here, try not to be too technical. But a taxonomy is like a digital dictionary or a digital rule book. It contains all the concepts that you might need to report something like Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, climate narratives. It's going to contain all of those, what we call concepts, that express the data that needs to be reported in a sustainability report. So what you see on the left side of the screen is what we call the presentation. How would this data appear? And on the right side of the screen, you see the properties of a particular type of data. So I'm going to just drill down into that a little bit. If you're looking at something like Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to have a computer-readable name, which is what you see at the top here. It's going to have a data type, reported in decimals, but it's actually greenhouse gas emissions, so that's the data type that's used. It has a standard label, which is kind of the human-readable label. It has a definition. And it may also have authoritative references back to somebody like at the IFRS. So all of this information ensures that each data point is unambiguously understood from start to finish, from all the users across the spectrum, from the issuer, the reporting entity, down to the end user. And now, when a report is created, actually, let me just go back here a second. When a sustainability report or a financial statement is created that is digitized, that has XBRL embedded or tagged into each of the facts, it's almost like a mini database. And that mini database has all the information that you need to extract the data, and it's completely machine readable. And so one of the benefits for the regulatory organizations is that they can take those reports, they get them, they're submitted directly into the regulator, and they're instantly machine readable. They can post them on their website, create just like an index of them on their website, and they can be used by the competitive marketplace, by anybody who has access to them. So this is what the SEC does today. So the SEC, as I said, about 6,000 public companies and thousands of investment management companies submit their data to the SEC each quarter. And when they submit them, all the SEC does, they're kind of like a pass-through. They collect them, they verify that the right entity sent them in, and then they post them. And this is a listing of all the 10Ks, the latest filings that have been submitted. So when those 10Ks come in, users of the data, like data aggregators or analytical tool providers, they just suck that data out, drop it into their databases or their analytical tools, and they can start using it right away. It's very easy for the SEC. I mean, there's still a lot that goes behind the data collection process, of course. We can't, ignore that. But it's still, all they have to do is post the data. And then when the data is posted, like if we look at the CB Financial Services, that's a company that provided their 10K, they do this every quarter. If you click on that document, you pull up a fully machine-readable report. And this is, we're looking at a document where everything that has a red bound around it, like a red line above and a red line below, those are all tagged pieces of information. And if you click on one of them, it's going to bring up a pop-up box that tells you exactly what that data point represents. So that's one of the big benefits of digital reporting, is that it minimizes workload on everybody, frankly. So at the end of the day, the impact for reporting companies, there's much greater clarity in what they need to report. We know that sustainability reporting today is a little bit complicated. There are lots of surveys, there's lots of different requests from stakeholders for different types of data. With digital reporting, there's a taxonomy that says, okay, this is the data point, this is the kind of data you need to use to represent it, this is a definition, this is the authoritative reference, to make sure that it's unambiguous. So there are concrete definitions, data types, there's very clear guidance on what can and what should be reported. It facilitates reporting for companies with a global footprint. So if you're reporting to, say, the CSRD or to an IFRS reporting country, you can prepare a single report and use it, repurpose it for multiple regulators. So it eliminates that duplicate reporting. And, but we also know that there are a lot of small companies that may not have a global footprint, but simple tools can be created, inexpensive open source tools can be created for those smaller entities to help satisfy their requirements. For collectors of data, it's pretty obvious. It's machine-readable data. The data can be posted as submitted. There's no need for a CARB or another regulator to build costly screening and querying tools, higher data integrity, and it's easier to adapt to reporting changes. And lastly, for users of the data, it's faster, less expensive processing, cheaper to use, high integrity, and consistent and comparable data that's reported. So that's all that we wanted to say about digital reporting, about some of the requirements. And I want to open it up to questions. I don't know if we received any questions in our app. So Dan, do you have any final words that you want to say as we close out this session?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mentioned quite a few different regulations and frameworks, but I would just encourage everyone to just keep a close eye on changes happening there. It's a evolving space. There's new information all the time about the programs. But, really try to take a look at the source information that's coming out. If there's any information coming out from the groups that are involved in the CSRD, for example, the technical groups, you're going to see some interpretations of those reports and some hot takes. But I just encourage everyone that's in this space to really look for yourself at the information that's contained within there and try to take away what those changes are likely to be and how those might play out in the market once they go into effect. So, that would be my...
I agree, and given that all of these requirements are coming out with assurance requirements, there's a big difference between voluntary reporting and mandatory regulatory reporting. And so there's going to be, a sea change is happening. And so really getting a handle, and I think we're going to go into this, and I don't want to take Corinne and Jennifer's thunder, but there's a lot of prep that needs to go in to be ready for assurance. And so I just talked about a little bit about the standards. The auditors need to follow these standards. They need to be performing these assurance engagements. So I won't take any more time away from the next panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Just my final word is that if there are companies that, if there are companies here or there are companies that you're aware of that are interested in having their documents prepared in XBRL format, we would love to do that. So please let us know. With that, we're going to finish this session, and we're going to ask people to take a 5-minute break. We've got more snacks and coffee, and then we'll have our final panel for the day. Okay, thank you. Don't worry about it. Okay, for our next panel is how companies are preparing. And you've met Amy already, okay? And I want to introduce Corrine Doherty, second here. Corrine is the Sustainability Audit Leader for KPMG US. She is based in Washington, D.C. And then we have Jennifer Harity. Jennifer is ESG and Sustainability Director at Sensiba, where she oversees internal sustainability initiatives and reporting. And she founded the firm's sustainability and ESG practice. So with that, I'm going to come sit over here. And to get started, we're just going to ask each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves. So maybe we start with Jennifer.
Thank you. So yes, Jennifer Harity, Sensiba now. I am a 25-year marketer, right? I'm technically a recovering marketer right now. Transitioned into ESG and sustainability by sheer chance and following of passion. I was very, very fortunate that my managing partner and partners at my firm recognized the value of having me start an ESG sustainability practice at an accounting firm. We're here, we're focused in the Bay Area. We've got offices up in Portland and Bend, Oregon, and we'll be doing some expanding this year. But so that's my realm. Is I've got the marketing background with sustainability passion, and I've got a team now, about 7 people, that have extensive backgrounds in sustainability, ESG, climate transition, things like that. And we focus very much on the material metrics for our clients and how to take ESG and sustainability initiatives and tie them directly to top and bottom line ROI. Because we're an accounting firm, after all.
Yeah.
Corrine?
Hi, Corrine Doherty, again, partner with KPMG. And so my background is an auditor. I grew up in the firm as a financial statement auditor, spent over 20 years focusing on financial statement audits, but about probably now 6 years ago, started working on sustainability or ESG assurance engagements. And so if you can imagine, 6 years ago, ESG or sustainability reporting is not necessarily where it is now, just in terms of the regulatory reporting. So it was kind of a nights and weekends job while I was doing my financial statement audits. But 4 years ago, the firm created our sustainability audit practice, and that's really where I spend the majority of my time now, performing assurance for companies that are getting voluntary reporting, and we'll talk more about the regulatory reporting, and you heard that from Dan earlier today. But I'm spending now a lot of my time talking with clients about how to get ready for regulatory reporting, whether it's California, it was the SEC, and now CSRD over in Europe. And so we have a group of professionals across the United States that are focused on this type of work. So happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
And hi, I'm Amy Beers. I am a senior director at the AICPA. My team is called the Assurance and Advisory Innovation Team. So what we do is we look at new and emerging areas for assurance services. And sustainability has actually been on our team's agenda for over 10 years now. We recognize that broader business reporting, sustainability reporting is really an extension of financial reporting. And so, CPAs and finance professionals have the skill set and the knowledge to be able to measure, report, provide assurance in this area. And so we've established a number of working groups on sustainability. We've put out guides, assurance guides, on performing assurance services. We work very hard in advocating for the profession. I mentioned in the last session how we're partnering with the California State Society in terms of responding to CARB. We do that for many different jurisdictions and many different requirements. We obviously were very involved with the SEC when they were putting their climate laws together. So we're really here to support CPAs both in business and in the firms to be able to provide services and serve their companies in sustainability reporting and assurance.
Great, thank you. So I first want to start with Amy, and I understand that the AICPA actually has conducted a study on kind of the state of play in sustainability reporting. And just wonder if you could give us some insights into what you found. I believe that you have some slides.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, let me get up here. So we've done a number of research studies. We've been working with the International Federation of Accountants for a number of years to look at and benchmark what's happening around the world with sustainability reporting. And so we started this study back in 2019. And so what we're looking at here is we've tracked over 1,400 companies in 22 different jurisdictions, and we're looking at the extent of sustainability reporting. So what standards are they using? What is being reported? Like, what's the scope of the reporting? And then we also look at where the reporting is being done. Is it being done in a separate sustainability report? Are companies starting to incorporate this information into their annual reports or to an integrated report? We also looked at assurance. And so when we looked at assurance, we look at the level of assurance, the assurance standards that are used, as well as who is providing that assurance. And so what we found was that across the globe, and so these are the largest companies around the world. So the largest, say, in the United States, the largest 100 companies here in the United States. But in each of the different jurisdictions, depending on size, it was either 50 to 100 companies, making up that 1,400 company pool. And so we found that the level of reporting is high. So 98% of the companies in our study are reporting some sort of sustainability information. And that almost 70%, 69% in 2022 were getting assurance. And over half of that is actually being conducted by the accounting firms. And so we put out this study every year. This is actually February 2024's report. I was hoping to have 2025's report, but that's coming out in the next couple of weeks. And so this will be updated. I put a QR code there so that you'll go to our website. It will be coming out in the next 2 weeks, and it'll have the 2023 data. But with that, I also mentioned our partner, the Center for Audit Quality, also does a similar report looking at, in the US, the S&P 500. So I thought this would be interesting for you to see what's happening here in the US. They've also been conducting this report over time as well. And so looking at the S&P 500, you'll see that, again, similar to the IFAC study, almost 98% of the companies are reporting here in the United States. Now, around the world, we're starting to see companies start to migrate where they're actually reporting this information. So in Europe, for example, a lot of the companies are starting to put this into their annual reports or more of an integrated report. Here in the US, almost 100% of this reporting is done in a separate sustainability report. So what are they reporting on, and what standards are they using? Well, the majority have referenced the three most common standards, so the SASB standards, the TCFD framework, or GRI. So obviously with SASB and TCFD coming together under the ISSB, I expect a large percentage of these companies are going to start adopting ISSB standards here in the US voluntarily, mind you. Companies, when they looked at that, they noted that companies use the standards at varying degrees. So some are reporting that they fully adopt them, while others might partially adopt or just reference these standards. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Looking at assurance here in the US, similar to the global numbers, in the S&P 500, 70% in 2022 obtained assurance, and that's been increasing over time. We also looked at what is being assured. So what information is getting subject to assurance? Predominantly, it's GHG emissions, but we're also starting to see companies get 1, 2, or 3 other metrics assured as well. And most of this assurance was at a limited assurance basis. Most of these engagements are limited assurance. This next slide I thought was kind of interesting. So of the information that's being assured, I mentioned those 1 to 3 other metrics. You could see the variance of different types of information. So the highest was energy, but you also see a growth in water metrics, and then waste. So, and even some human capital or employee health and safety. So I see, a lot of growth in what's being reported, as well as them being subject to assurance even before these mandates even kick in, and some of these companies won't even be part of these mandates. So interesting. Another study that CAQ had done, which has just come out a couple weeks ago, I mentioned how most of this information is getting reported in a separate sustainability report. Well, they also conducted a study looking at the 10K and looking to see where climate information is reported in the 10K. And so what we found is most of the companies in the S&P 500 are mentioning something about climate in their 10K. Lots of different information was being reported, but what we did see is that companies are talking about reporting on their capital expenditures related to climate investments, the dollar amounts of their R&D. They're reporting on losses related to weather events. They're also reporting on either the use of or sale of carbon offsets or renewable energy credits. They're also reporting on commitments they're making for either going net zero or carbon neutral. So interestingly enough, the information is now seeping its way into the financial statements and the 10K reports. And finally, what section is this information mostly seen in? And almost all of the companies are reporting it in their risk section, right? Item 1A, they all have climate risk factors, but more and more we're starting to see it within the MD&A and in the financial statements themselves, in footnote disclosures, specifically around capital expenditures, as I mentioned, losses, a lot about sustainability, debt disclosures, and loans. So again, within the financial statements, and obviously subject to audit, or at least potential audit requirements. And that's it. That's all I have. Thanks.
So let's move on with other questions here. Actually has some questions for Maureen and Jennifer. And as you're working with your clients, what are you finding that they're doing in terms of preparing for the mandates that are ongoing?
Start and then I'll.
Sure. So we predominantly work with small, medium-sized, privately held organizations. Revenues anywhere from 50 million in revenue all the way up to 2.3 billion in revenue. So we have a little bit of a range that we work with, and what we're seeing is clients that organizations that want to report and do the right thing are already measuring, and they have been for a few years. We've got companies that are keeping their close eye on these regulations, and some of them are being a little more proactive, but for the most part, folks are still dragging their heels a little bit in preparing. And the more you get down into the realm of folks that aren't going to be mandatory to report, but are within the supply chain of the folks who are, they're still kind of head in the sand. And they're like, oh, but that's not until 2026. And I said, yeah, but that's on 2025 data. And in order to understand how you're going to measure and where you're going to keep that data, you kind of need to start looking at that in 2024, last year. So you kind of have to get on this if this is, you need to have your data, your data ducks in a row, because your major customers are going to start asking you for these things. And I think within the last few months, they've started getting those requests. They've started to see requests come through for carbon data. They've seen requests come through for different certifications like EcoVadis, which also requires that climate-related data. So I think definitely we're seeing companies be more interested in this type of non-financial data. And it's catching a few folks off guard, and they're unprepared. And we're trying to message out to our clients, hey, get in front of this, because it's gonna save you a lot of angst going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I would say a lot of the clients that I'm working with have already been reporting, where now they're really focused on, well, how do we get ready for assurance? And what's interesting, just based on my experience in this space, when I first started out, when I was conducting my assurance engagements, I never talked to finance. I only ever talked to the sustainability folks, which depending on the organization, they can sit in various different places, whether it's investor relations, legal. But what was really interesting with the SEC proposal that came out, now it's a final rule that stayed, but once that came out, finance started coming to the table. And so now companies that have been voluntarily reporting this information, a lot of times didn't really connect or interact with finance. And so we've seen this shift over the last several years, especially with the SEC previous years coming out with comment letters of saying, okay, company, you're reporting X in your sustainability report, but I don't see that anywhere in your 10K. And so finance is coming to the table a lot. And so now companies that have been voluntarily reporting greenhouse gas emissions and other metrics are now getting ready for assurance. And what that means is, well, do we have processes and controls around this data? Because previously, finance really wasn't, at least in a lot of cases, I'm not saying in every case, wasn't involved. And so some of the times, some of those folks that were preparing the data don't really fully understand like processes and controls like accountants do. And so now companies are trying to figure out, okay, what's our governance reporting structure? Is internal audit going to come to the table and start helping us get ready? And so looking at it from the data collection lens, and especially with greenhouse gas emissions, it can be really challenging depending on how complex of an organization you have, especially when you're considering scope 3 emissions. And so I think it's, a lot of times it's getting ready for assurance, but Jennifer, to your point, we also have clients that haven't started even reporting. And so for those folks, it's a matter of, okay, well, you need to just get a handle on your greenhouse gas inventory, like period and stop. And then once you do that and kind of do your gap analysis, from there you can start to really develop from the bottoms up approach in terms of what are your processes and controls and going to be the data around this. Because under California, I mean, this is going to be an annual requirement of reporting as well as assurance. And so it's a different mindset from a standpoint of, it's not, to your point, it's non-financial information, but it's going to be held up to the same rigor ultimately once you get to reasonable assurance as a financial statement audit. So how do you go from either never reporting this information or reporting it without a lot of controls around it to then ultimately getting assurance ready? But another thing, the one thing I'll also add in is that companies are also thinking about what systems to help implement as well too. Because one of the issues that I've seen a lot on the assurance side is all of this data would sit in Excel spreadsheets. And you can understand that there could be manual issues in terms of data input errors, and I've seen it a lot on my limited assurance engagements. And so system implementation, there's definitely different types of systems that companies can use, but I would say that is also where once companies have their inventory and at least their processes down, then that's kind of the next step, is implementing, well, what systems are we gonna use to be able to collect, compile, and calculate greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Just one thought on that. You know, you talked about the assurance requirements, making it more, we kind of have companies going from voluntary, no assurance, do whatever you want kind of thing, you know, report to all these different stakeholders, to regulatory. So that's one big push, and then also the assurance on top of that. Do you think it's the combination, or do you think it's the assurance that's making it that much more stringent and more serious for them? Or is it that the C-suite is paying more attention because it's a regulatory requirement, or is it just a combination of both?
I would say, and would appreciate your input, Jennifer, I would say the C-suite taking notice of it is really coming from a regulatory side, from a compliance side. Well, I guess maybe I would say it depends on the organization, because there are some companies that have been voluntarily reporting this information and getting assurance voluntarily because it is the mission of the organization. They want to be seen as a leader. So in those cases, I would say C-suite's already bought in. But there's going to be companies that are like, you know what, we want to comply. We don't want to be the first out of the gate to do this. Like, we want to see what our competitors are doing, and then we'll come to the table. I would say the assurance requirements definitely has sparked a lot more interest from the C-suite, especially, like I said, based on my experience with the SEC climate rule, that's when finance came to the table. That's when, the C-suite was definitely, and the board was a lot more focused on it. I would say I've had a lot more conversations with the boards of organizations than I would say I have in the past. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts to that. Or...
Yeah, no, definitely a lot more conversations with boards. And yeah, I think when we started putting sustainability and assurance together in sentences, CFOs definitely perked up and said, "Wait a minute, assurance. That means I'm going to be in charge of that. That's going to be my name on those reports." And they started to kind of take the reins a little bit more. And suddenly, instead of having sustainability and marketing on the calls for our engagements, we suddenly started to see the CFO, the COO. General counsel, a lot of general counsels on a lot of calls, because as we start to go through this, and having the CEOs on the call, they start recognizing, wait a minute, you're talking about this data, but you're also really pointing to different risks in our organization. And once the R words get said, that's when we got the general counsels started to join the calls. And really start to pick up the amount of players that were having buy-in and wanting to dig into the data.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll also add, obviously regulation drives the need for assurance, the need for quality, the need for these processes and governance over this. But you also mentioned supply chain. And we're starting to see some of the big companies, like some of them out here,
Speak louder.
who are requiring supplier code of conduct and requiring not only is this information reported, but they're requiring assurance over the information through the supply chain. So that's another driver for quality reporting as well as assurance. It's not just the regulations.
That's a really good point.
So here's, kind of the million-dollar question. So attitudes about sustainability reporting, have evolved with the move towards mandatory reporting versus voluntary. But there have also been a lot of political changes that we've seen here in the United States with change in administration, but also in Europe. Have these changes affected your clients and how they work and your own work in dealing with this? I'm going to turn to Jennifer for that one.
Knew they were going to start with me on this one. So, in bringing in regulations, before we had the administration change, we were having a lot of folks speaking up and getting loud and making some very, very similar comments to when, we implemented financial regulations, right? So if we look back at history, because history repeats itself, right? So if you look at after the Great Depression, when businesses needed, we had financial statements and rules around those things come to play, and businesses were really cranky around that. And they were saying, oh, this is really unfair to business. This is, going to hurt small business. Pretty much the same exact stuff that's being said about reporting the non-financial metrics now. So just because back then we had people cooking the books in regards to their financial stuff, we're kind of having companies cooking the books in environmental and social right now. And so we're going to have some regulations put into play to kind of clean things up, kind of like we did with putting in rules for financial statements and P&Ls, things like that, right? So, doing that sort of thing, you're going to hit some bumps in the road, but it's very interesting that we're getting very similar comments that were pretty much the same arguments back then. And yeah, the political changes have definitely changed some attitudes, for sure. And yeah, it's it's something that I know a lot of clients, they still want to lean in and do some of the work, but they want to call it something different. And I've told my clients, I don't care what we call it on the SW, if we can still get the work done. If you can get the funding for this and we can still get the work done, that's what matters. I'll call it whatever you want. We can call it a purple elephant initiative, like, but if we just get the work done. Some clients are wanting us to rename their sustainability reports and call it something different, right? And try to, hide the vegetables in the meatloaf, if you will. And in the reporting, right? So talk about adding in, the financial and business annual metrics, right? And the annual business report, but then slide in some of the ESG metrics. And kind of hide them in the report a little bit, so that they're still doing it. They're still getting that report because they recognize they're gonna need that reporting for the states. They're gonna need that reporting for their European entities, right? So they need to do the report, but they don't wanna lose clients. They don't wanna have, some of the, nonprofit room, they don't wanna lose their grants, so we're really doing a really walk the line type of thing with a lot of our clients. Like, okay, we'll call it whatever you want, as long as we can get the work done, because that's what's important right now.
No, I was gonna say, climate's still a mega trend, and we're still living in an environment where there's risks on companies from it. Companies aren't pulling back on their commitments. If they've maybe pushed them out potentially, because maybe they don't have that regulatory pressure, but they're still there. And so we haven't seen necessarily that it's going away anytime soon. It might be getting pushed out a little bit. Even the EU, I think some people said that maybe it was going too fast and furious, right? I mean, there was a lot, companies were completely overwhelmed and not ready, to be honest, not ready to report. And so the fact that they're pulling some of it back doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, because maybe we'll get it right and do it the right way.
Yeah, and some of those initial reports, the accounting firms weren't even ready.
Right.
The reports were very, very telling. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is just, when you talk to your clients, are they still seeing that they're, maybe not, there's obviously kind of a chilling effect going on right now, but when you talk to your clients, are they still finding that there's demand for that data?
Yes.
Yes. From investors, from their supply chain, their clients are asking them. I don't know how many calls I've gotten in the last month where they said, one of our major clients is asking for us to report this, and we have to comply within 2 weeks. And we're like, okay, 2 weeks, that's our timeline. All right, let's go. And it's that demand. But what we're also, there's also a story around, this type of reporting and how it really enhances your reputation with your employees and with the clients who really care. When you look at the natural product foods category, and the folks, their customers want to see their products, that they've got carbon neutral on the side of the bottles, right? That matters to them, and that they're gonna pay more for that. And so putting out those reports to back up these claims, because also greenwashing is a big thing. Greenwashing, social hushing, social washing, all sorts of new terms that are coming up these days. So having those reports helps you back up those claims in a real way. So, and having that out there, it always amazes me for us. We're a certified B Corp. We put out an annual sustainability report. Every time we have new onboarding, how many of those new employees have actually read our sustainability report cover to cover? And it just astonishes me. I was like, wow, you really dug into that. Like that's on like page 30. Like, wow, okay. You didn't just do a gloss over. So it really does make an impact with just hiring and retaining top talent.
Yep.
And really engaging with your client base and making them feel heard.
Yeah, we've heard that obviously, the younger generation coming up through, coming out of college now, this is a really, really important topic for them. And they will make employment decisions based on the values of a company. They'll make consumption decisions based on values of companies. So if you're looking at the younger demographic, which is the future, obviously it makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah. I just literally spent the last 3 days at an HR conference. And all the HR professionals in the room were saying, yeah, we actually have people who we give offer letters to that will turn us down and say that the other position, that company aligns better with their values. Not that they're paying them more, but it aligns better with their values and their purpose.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and more than one person in the room was saying, they asked, and a good 2/3 of the room raised their hand.
Yeah, and it's not just anecdotal, like we've done research on that, and we've found the same.
Okay. Well, now a little bit more technical question. This is for Corinne. How does assurance actually work in ESG reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I would say how ESG assurance works, quite frankly, is really not that different from a financial statement audit per se. The only real difference is the subject matter. So as an auditor, we're still going to do risk assessment. We're still going to get an understanding of the management's process. It's just instead of assuring revenue, expenses, balance sheet items, it's greenhouse gas emissions, it's waste and water metrics. And so it's a little bit tricky from when you're figuring out like materiality, but we still set materiality. So it's all kind of the same concepts. I mean, same different standards, but really at the end of the day, they're not that different. If it helps any, when we're looking for, when we started our Center of Excellence several years ago, we didn't start by hiring greenhouse gas emission experts that have engineering backgrounds. We took auditors from the field that know how to audit and educated them on greenhouse gas emissions. Kind of like it was a new accounting standard. I mean, it's just different information. And so when you apply that concept, I'd rather take, an auditor and teach them greenhouse gas emissions, teach them about waste and water metrics, because they have that fundamental auditing down. And so from that aspect, it's not really any different. I think with working with management, it's about making sure that, like I mentioned before, those internal controls over the data, the quality of the data is good. And so from that aspect, it's not too terribly different. But it's when we're talking limited assurance, and Amy went through the differences between limited and reasonable, sometimes as auditors, it's a little bit more challenging to be like, oh, wait, this is only limited. I don't need to look at it with the same lens as, we're issuing an opinion. And so sometimes that can get murky with talking with management about like what's acceptable documentation. But from that standpoint, I would say, take an auditor from the field that has financial statement background and educate them on the standards. And it's kind of the same on management side as well, too, because that's what a question I was getting actually quite a lot from boards over the last several years, because there's a new position, well, I say fairly new position within management called an ESG controller, which typically sits within the finance group. And those individuals have like SEC reporting background, like actually have financial reporting experience, but now they're responsible for the reporting of sustainability ESG topics. And so in most of those cases that I've seen at clients, is that person has a finance background, but then they're educated on the subject matter, and then they're responsible within getting all the different groups within the organization to come to the table, because you have sustainability folks, you have risk potentially, you have HR folks for like social type metrics. And so it's just kind of a different lens, but I wouldn't say, Michelle, that it's like a completely different audit. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
No, absolutely, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. I think those are all the kind of prepared questions that I have. And what we wanted to do now is kind of open it up to the group here and ask some of you questions. So I want to invite Dan to come back up again as our other panelist here. And grab a chair. So we had sent, some questions out to the group. I
think this is
that we're interested in discussing. And, you know, they should be in the back of your handout that you've received. So one of the questions that we've been asking everybody is, what are companies doing to prepare? Are they preparing? You know, what kinds of companies are getting ready? And I'd like to just see if, you know, our audience here, we've got, in the audience, we have public companies, we have climate people, we have all kinds of different organizations involved. Tell us what you're hearing in the market. And Dan, you can start too, but, okay, Steve.
So for context, I'm Steve Soder. I am with the pro groups, but also with Workiva, that nationally sponsor the pro groups as well. And for context, we serve 6,000 plus global customers, 8% of the Fortune 1,000. And what's interesting, the dialogue that I'm hearing is really consistent. We did a survey late last year, 1,600 respondents. It's global, C-suite plus institutional investors. 85% of those surveys said that regardless of what's happening politically, they intend to move forward with climate disclosure. 97% said that they find business value in doing so. And so one of the dialogues that we're hearing about this whole notion of preparing is a little bit of a paradigm shift from what's been largely a compliance regulatory conversation to a primarily driving business value. And what's been an interesting paradigm, at least for me and for service providers and those providing assurance, is that, again, we've all sort of been thinking about this from a regulatory standpoint because it's a really big deal. If you have regulations, right, to comply with, you don't want to mess that up. But I think these companies are now having to maybe pivot just a little bit back towards that driving business value conversation. Another interesting thing that came out of that survey, to more directly answer your question about preparation, is that nearly 23% for the financial data, and then it's like almost a third for the internal controls. But the executives, nearly a quarter of those executives said they didn't trust their financial reporting data, and a third said they didn't trust their internal controls over either data set, financial reporting or sustainability. And that, to me, I think is where so much of the effort is going into preparing right now, is to fixing that. I mean, you're living in this world every day, I would assume, right? It is not sustainable, it is highly risky, it is very inefficient. Nobody's going to knowingly, let untrusted data go out the door, which means there's manual processes and spreadsheet cleanup, right? All the things that have to make comfortable. That, to me, feels like this other notion of preparing is like, how do we fix that? Or we have a talent shortage looming, we have Gen AI hanging out there. It's like all of these things are either starting to converge and come to a head, and we really have to figure out, like, okay, what are we going to report and why? What business value do we expect it to provide? And then what's this regulatory compliance element of it? Which, again, I think we're shifting away a little bit from that, more to business value, just because of the overall environment that we're in. And a lot of that's accentuated by what they're trying to do via the omnibus proposals. So that was a bit of word salad, sorry.
That was really interesting,
Our customers are talking about this with a real sense of urgency.
That's good to know. Good to know. Anybody else want to jump in on that question, that thought? Chelsea.
So I'm with Copeland Merrill, the director of ESG, supporting our clients who are doing sustainability, ESG, CSR, whatever you want to call it. And we hear both sides of the table. So we hear some that are saying, yes, we want to shift the terminology of our report, we want to get away from DEI, and it's not necessarily because they don't believe in it or it's not part of their values, it's because there's concern and they don't want to be highlighted, they don't want to, it's honestly them seeking more like legal advice in this space because there's just backlash that they don't want to potentially deal with. Then, there are others who are saying, kind of like you mentioned before, maybe this is part of their mission or part of what drives that company, and so they're keeping their foot on the gas pedal, and they're going to remain using that terminology in their reports and continue to set those targets and those goals. But we're also seeing kind of this shift in the reporting as well, and I think it has to do with some of the regulations, and just touched on a little bit of maybe moving more towards integrated reporting, so maybe not releasing a standalone sustainability report anymore, and so then that could be because they feel like it might take the pressure off a little bit, where they don't have to make those decisions around terminology. And then just shifting to this integrated reporting that, maybe they think will be used for state regulations, other types of regulations. So I think a lot is in flux and at play, considering how the regulations land, what happens with all the different state standards, the timeline of all of this. We had some clients who were ready to start talking about CSRD, and then on the bus hit, and they said, we'll talk to you in 2 years.
Yep.
It varies day to day.
Thank you. Sure.
I'm Michael Muss, business consultant with DFIN. A lot of my discussions kind of revolve around the actual reporting function at a lot of our clients. And a lot of them want to know the actual mechanisms about how they get this new subject matter, this new data set. How do they integrate it with their existing systems? How do they get their full scope of both their financial and their sustainability related information all under the same internal control umbrella, if you will? And thankfully, I'm kind of mirroring what you're saying, where you have the knowledge, you have the structure, you just need to adapt it to this.
Yep.
And the second I say that, it clicks for a lot of them. But now the question starts to become, how do we accurately capture that data, audit it, review it, make it ready for any level of assurance that we need to get? So I had tons of questions at Slido, but I wanted to ask the panel now. The question was like, how critical does a data management system surrounding sustainability specific information become alongside, say, a GL system, or does it become, say, integrated into something like that? Because they know that they need to get the data, now they need to understand how to manage it. And part of the discussions I have is like, okay, how do we do that in the least painful way possible?
Unfortunately, that first benchmark year is always pretty painful.
Yeah.
And instituting systems that can capture a lot of the data that's needed. I think where we start with our clients is walking them through, this is, here's what you need to pull for scope 1, scope 2, here's what materially you should be reporting on for scope 3, where to go find this data. And a lot of times they're like, we don't even track that.
Yeah.
And so they kind of have to go back and develop systems, processes, procedures, figure out whose job title is that going to fall under, rewrite job descriptions, right, and responsibilities. And so that first year is always a little more daunting. And normally the benchmarks are usually with spend data than activity data. And so, it's going to be painful. We don't sugarcoat it. We don't sugarcoat it at all.
Change is hard.
Yeah.
One thing that I'll add to that is that, the first year is difficult, and you think about it from like an annual compliance reporting perspective, but where I've seen companies, and KPMG actually reports information as well too, we've got it down to, like, we report that information monthly now. Like, we have the capabilities to pull our greenhouse gas emissions monthly because we have the software systems in place, and it kind of gets back to what gets measured gets managed. And so when you have that real-time data, you're able to make more operational decisions and go to your point of going, well, what's the value versus it just being a compliance exercise? Like, that is the end goal, I would think. It's putting the systems in place to be able to get there. But we've seen, at least even at KPMG, working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because we have that real-time data and able to make decisions and figure out, are we going to do more purchase power agreements, whatever that ends up being, to be able to meet our commitments.
Yeah, and a case study for doing this work is, we had a winery client that we worked with, and we did their full inventory, their baseline. We recognized most of their emissions were coming from, shocker, shipping their wine. And, so we looked at that. We're like, okay, well, let's break it down. Obviously, there's the weight of the case. Well, why is the case so heavy? Well, it's the wine bottles. Anyone who's been around wine knows that there is a myth out there that the heavier the bottle, the better the wine. So we suggested to them to lightweight their bottles a little bit, which was a scandalous thing to talk about in the wine. What? And when we really broke it down and posed it to them, they said, okay, we'll just shave 5% off the glass. We'll take it off the bottom, the pen of the bottle. And, the bottle will be lighter. The cases will weigh less, which means you're going to be less of a footprint for shipping your cases. And they said, okay, well, we'll do it with just 2 of our brands. Well, just 2 of our brands, because everyone's going to notice. Like, no one's going to notice. And there was one place they did notice, though. So they did this, and yes, they saved a ton of money. They saved the money on, the actual bottles that they were purchasing, because it was less glass used, right? And the actual, lighting of the forges to melt the glass, to, the shipping weight. So they had lots of savings, lots of bottom line savings. However, what we didn't predict was that the clerks in the stores noticed that their cases weighed less, so they were taking them to the front of the stores for their displays because they weren't so heavy to carry. Their sales
So interesting.
doubled on the 2 brands immediately because they were getting prime placement in the stores. And they said, okay, we're gonna do this across the board with all of our brands. And they're now one of the most sustainable wine brands out there. And it's pretty cool to see when you can have just that little metric show you exactly where, and how you break it down and go, okay, well, why is it? What is going into that? And making those adjustments that really do hit top and bottom line.
That's a great story. Well, actually, go ahead.
Yeah, no, one thing I wanted to kind of address with this question is that with it, in terms of pulling together this data and having it available on timelines, one thing is really important within companies, I've heard, is to have teams working with each other and not have the sustainability work kind of siloed.
Yeah.
ESG controllers can be really helpful in kind of facilitating that. And if you have that controller, different departments that are contributing data and insight into an environmental management system where they're able to put this data in and have it reviewed, I think it can accelerate the process and just result in better quality. Just feedback that I've heard from companies that have kind of put those structures in place.
I've heard the same. Yeah, the more they talk to each other, the better everything is.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay, Chelsea.
I have a question, playing off that conversation of getting people to talk to each other. Are you ladies seeing in your field that the designated role for ESG or sustainability is starting to dwindle at all? Question number 1. Or is it maybe being passed on to others that now have this added to their responsibilities, like an IR director, whatnot? And if so, how is that impacting them managing ESG and sustainability?
Do you want to take it, or do you want me to?
I'm welcome to start. I'm seeing more and more folks empowering people in their organizations that are passionate about this and making it part of their role, but not as like, okay, and this too, but more like shifting their role. So they're still doing maybe 20 or 30% of their old role, but they're now leaning in to ESG and DEI and all of those things. And I'm starting to see that more and more, which gets me excited, particularly because not only do we have regulations, we're certified B Corp, I work in the B Corp realm, Bay Local Bay Area board chair, so just disclosure. A lot of companies that are B Corps, because those standards are also leveling up, coming up soon, they're hiring full-time staff people because there's just because of trying to maintain that certification, and now we've got regulations, and now customers and investors are requiring this. It's basic creating a full-time need within organizations. And for smaller organizations that can't, we've actually started offering fractional CSO services. And that is probably our fastest growing service line at our organization. Is to be able to empower their internal teams and working with the HR person and the CFO and the marketing person and empowering them and teaching them how to work together to create their own little sustainability kind of committee within their organization, and being that kind of chief level to help guide them and direct them through that process.
I'd say the only thing that I would add is I work with large U.S. based multinational companies. And I would say most of them have folks that are solely dedicated where ESG or sustainability reporting is their sole job. I think really where it differs is how many people they have. Like I met with a client here in the Bay Area and it's her and 2 other people. And she's like, it's so much. But she was leaning on, internal audit was helping quite a bit. And she was leaning on different groups within the organization where, I mean, some really large companies have ESG controllers and they have a big team. So I think it really depends. But when we're talking with US multinational companies that have to report California, especially CSRD in the EU, because that is substantial. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with Omnibus, but still, the way it stands now, that is substantial reporting compared to what companies are voluntarily reporting or any other regulations. And then you have ISSB. And so when you have companies that have to comply with all of those reporting, regulatory reporting requirements, there has to be a team of people. But kind of that question is how many? And I would say probably every person that I talk to within the organization that this is their responsibility says they don't have enough people, even with the potential 2-year delay of CSRD, because most companies I'm talking to are not pausing. It's, okay, well, now we actually have time to implement processes and controls and our governance structure because, I mean, I was talking to clients where we were going to start the limited assurance engagement in the fall for reporting for next year. And it was like, they only had a certain amount of months to get ready. And now they're like, oh, we have more time. So we can put like processes and controls in place. Because I was going to start really early for limited assurance for CSRD because I kind of knew first year was going to be a challenge. So, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, we were worried that there was going to be a lot of disclaimers.
You know, it's interesting because we thought that coming out of wave 1, but what we've seen so far is we haven't seen any qualifications. So I don't know. That's kind of what we were anticipating too, but we haven't seen much yet of that.
We're talking about the largest companies.
Yeah, that's true.
We're probably ready.
That's true. That's true. That is true.
So on this topic, Corinne mentioned earlier materiality, and I think that is an important lens to look at this disclosure work through. It's mandated for some programs, no mention of it for California's bill yet, it may come at some point. But ultimately what you're looking at is materiality for the company that's reporting. And there's different ways to measure that, but financial performance is pretty consistently one of those. So if you apply that lens to this information going out, you're ultimately looking at risks for a company from a financial perspective, potentially other perspectives. But when you look at it through that lens, it goes from like sustainability, ESG, still relevant, but more to a risk equation. So you're looking at the risks of a company, potentially opportunities, and the resilience of that company to respond to those risks. And once the information is known, put together a plan to help it mitigate those risks. So that's a kind of a framing of this type of work that I think is important for companies to look at it in this way, because ultimately they are trying to sustain, grow, and manage a stable organization.
Okay. Well, we actually have received a bunch of questions, which I'm sorry, I was looking at the app the wrong way, but so let me just bring these questions up to the group here. So what are the biggest areas where companies are falling short on ESG assurance requirements today?
Where are companies falling short on ESG assurance requirements? I would say, I kind of talked about this, but the quality of the data, as an auditor, I mean, we're assuring the data. And so I've had a client where this is, I think, 3rd year of reporting, and every year it's a challenge to get quality of data, and we've had to reselect samples multiple times. And so I would say the quality of the data is probably where I see the area where most improvement is needed. Just because, like I mentioned before, a lot of it's in spreadsheets, or maybe finance really or internal audit really aren't involved in the data accumulation process. So I would say quality of data as well as the audit trail of, just making sure that they're supporting documentation for a lot of Especially assumptions, because, I mean, there are some of the metrics that are based on estimates. And so when you think of how do you audit an estimate in the financial statement space, it's, well, understanding the model and the method of the calculation as well as the assumptions and the data inputs. That process for auditing an estimate for greenhouse gas emissions is essentially the same. So it's really, does management have a good understanding of the assumptions of the key data inputs, and do they have actual documentation for it? So I would say that's probably the data and the quality of the data, as well as supporting documentation from an audit trail. Because once, especially with California, once you move from limited assurance to reasonable assurance, I mean, yes, they give you, I think it's 3 years, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 or 4 years. I mean, that quite frankly is substantial, because under a limited assurance, there may be some cases where it's like, yeah, it's good from a limited assurance standpoint. Once you move to reasonable, like, that explanation may not cut it. Or we're gonna select a lot more of a sample. And so we've seen, actually, we've had some clients go from limited assurance to reasonable assurance and really kind of struggle when they get to reasonable assurance. Again, all voluntary at this point, just because of the level of data that is needed to support an opinion at a reasonable assurance level. So I would say the quality of the data and the data trail, the audit trail.
Okay. The next question that I thought was kind of interesting is, do you anticipate that sustainability-related data management systems will become as critical as a general ledger system?
That
or
was,
be-
yeah, that was his comment.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. That's a good question. Okay. What is your approach to assuring qualitative sustainability data versus quantitative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, quantitative is quite frankly a lot easier, because you can vouch and look to more supporting documentation. Qualitative data really gets to, it's kind of like within the financial statements of how you're auditing required footnote disclosures is based on the criteria, and whether that's GRI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISSB, and now potentially ESRSs, is that all of those standards require qualitative data to be disclosed. And so one of the first things as auditors do is we'll take a look at, are you disclosing everything that you should be disclosing, period, based on the criteria? And two, does it agree with any quantitative data? Is it what you're disclosing, is it really getting at what the criteria is asking you to disclose? And quite frankly, does it make sense to a reader? And is it contradictory depending on where the information is and how you're disclosing it? So it's sometimes a little bit harder for management to understand as an auditor what we look at, but it's fundamental to a full set of statements depending on the criteria. And so but it's harder to audit because you're not vouching to supporting documentation. It's a lot more judgment, but it's also supported based on the criteria that management is using. So hopefully that is helpful. But that's where, when you get into what I was talking about earlier with the ESRSs, I mean, there is a lot of qualitative data that's in the ESRSs, and part of what the omnibus is getting at in terms of the simplification is, the way I understand it, is really focusing more on that quantitative data and potentially reducing the qualitative, but we'll ultimately see where that part ends up.
And I have a question, Amy, for you. Has the AICPA engaged in capacity building or training on how climate should be integrated under existing accounting rules?
Well,
just talking about
first of all, we don't put out accounting rules. That's the FASB. So we only do the auditing standards. So that's first. But we do think capacity training and building is very important, and we do have a number of training programs that are available to members and non-members, specifically around sustainability reporting, climate measurement. A lot of our conferences address sustainability for our members. I mentioned for assurance providers, we've got a lot of guidance around the standards, a sustainability guide, a course that takes you through that guide. So we have been focusing and investing a lot in training and bringing members up to speed so that they are ready. Accounting standards, that, again, right now, I think we're going to let the ISSB really, kind of govern what's required to be reported and how it should be measured at this point.
Yeah. And I just want to point out, like, we need to remember how new all this is, right? Like, financial standards, how we do that stuff has been around for millennia, right? ISSB was just founded in November of 21.
Right.
Like, you gotta keep like a little bit of perspective. Like, people want it like all to be cooked and baked today, and it's like we're getting there. Like, we're figuring this out, and yeah, it's going to be painful, and there's going to be missteps, but like some grace, right? And that's
in 4 years.
and that's yeah. I mean, we've come a long way, and you know, that's why we see things like 219 coming back out and doing that, and omnibus, and like, okay, yeah, we went a little too far. Like, let's get a little more realistic with what we can do. Yes.
If I could just quickly add to that point, the ICC has come out with a number of different capacity building resources depending on the stakeholder group. So we have the FSA credential, which is helps accounting folks get up to speed on sustainability accounting. We're also working on regulatory capacity building, so we're launching a tool actually next week for regulators on implementing ISSB and building roadmaps for implementing ISSB standards. So that is all to come. Check our website for resources.
Great.
That's great. Okay, the last question, because we're about at the end of our time here, is about the reports that we show, the little case studies we have for Moody's and Benchmark, and those are on our website. And what we'll do is, we'll send a follow-up about this conference to all the attendees, all the registrants, and send you those links as well, so you can take a look at those. So I want to thank our panelists, all of our speakers, Dan, Amy, Corrine, Jennifer, and thank them all very much for their great insights today. Thank you.